No matter how captivating or sophisticated a game's gameplay is, the visual design can void its impact if there are uncaptivating, unsophisticated visuals constantly working in opposition to it. For this reason, I wish the world in Need for Speed Heat had been a little more emphatic, with a brighter palette and more striking features. Actually, when watching the trailer for the game, though not necessarily in an outright misleading sort of way, I was under the impression that it would be a bit more colorful and energetic, instead of what we got, dull hues and realistically mundane features, further veiled by an irremovable film grain. I thought the best part of Need for Speed Heat wasn't the racing, and it definitely wasn't the story. It was the map design, which is actually a bit of a shame because there's zero incentive to taking a Sunday drive. Should you ever slow down enough to appreciate the fine details, you'll incidentally notice how barren and static it is, in a way befitting an isolated desert town or even a quiet suburban city, not one of the largest international tourist destinations and metropolises in the US. The developers captured the recognizable aesthetics of Miami: pearly beaches and multicolored lifeguard huts, sun-bleached skyscrapers, open avenues, and its metro rail. You can find visual representations of some of Florida's real-life tourist attractions: the Sunshine Skyway Bridge, what I believe is supposed to be the Epcot, South Beach, street murals, and its numerous lighthouses. But for someone like me who's never been to Florida, or even within 1,000 miles of it, these details get lost as random and irrelevant models in the world space. I had no idea it made reference to real places until I was researching for this discussion. The races aren't constructed in a way to draw attention to its landmarks, and there's otherwise no incentive to explore them. So unlike the real Miami, its fictionalized counterpart ends up appearing more like a financial hub than a tourist hotspot. They had a really excellent excuse here to implement a feature like the Scout X tourism app in Watch Dogs 2, or photographing different cars in Forza Horizon. Simple features that don't take away from the core gameplay, but add flavor to pre-existing elements. Even though Palm City is supposed to be a fictionalized Miami, they designed it like it was faithful to it. Understated depictions with eerily sad and realistic features, rather than the cutified or hypified caricatures one would expect from a video game. They failed to capture its spirit or to create a caricature. Now, don't get me wrong, the Horizon series, which with each installment focuses on a specific real-life location, has historically fumbled in this aspect as well. Forza Horizon has always put its primary emphasis on geography, and prior to Horizon 4, failed to depict any depth of culture. Though a geographical location is obviously more than the summary of its natural and man-made parts, it's inextricably tied to the cultures and people who live there. Being that Horizon focuses on the natural aspects of a region and creates such prominent landmarks representing them, it is tended to skirt around that feeling of inadequacy. But Need for Speed Heat's location revolving around a major metropolis posed problems when it came to depicting culture. It's no doubt not an easy task to represent an entire geographical region in a satisfying way, both geologically and culturally. But because Need for Speed Heat has such low-key racing mechanics, I wanted more from its visual and thematic delivery than it was able to give. I wanted them to capture the essence of Miami beyond a loose Florida digest. However, in March, tens of thousands of university students flocked to its beaches to party, many of which would surely seek highs elsewhere too, such as through street racing as fans or participants. Miami is also well known for being the cruise capital of the world, but the game seemed to lack even one of these water behemoths, vessels that would make for some pretty prominent and interesting landmarks by the seaside, even while zipping by at 200 miles an hour. It just completely whiffs on the spirit of Miami, apart from a few neon lights that vaguely represent its vaporwave cocaine-fueled 80s debauchery. A combination of POV, high speeds, muddy graphics, and gameplay objectives make the world design very hard to appreciate, and you have to crane your camera up or be standing still to notice all the detailed patterns and features of a cityscape. Viewing the world in first person dramatically changed my experience, but third person is not an avant garde or uncommon choice among players, so that needs to be an equally viable option for experiencing the game space. You can see here that these two balconies, side by side, aren't just a copy and paste of the same thing. Someone designed separate models to make the architecture look distinct, and while you can find these models at different parts of the city, it's very well constructed to feel natural and organic. But in a way, these details come off as almost pointless. Because with gameplay focused on nitrous tanks and heat levels, there's no incentive to slow down and soak in the salty air and roadside green. In Forza, I would expect a hairpin, perhaps to have some kind of interesting building or design as you drive toward it, and during your point of deceleration, you would notice it. During the day race Ray of Light in Mendoza Keys, you round a lighthouse in this fashion, but it is just a tall gray erection, like everything that one friend constructs in Minecraft. At night, this area has dramatic neon lights, yet, so far as I can tell, no race goes near it. Why is the lighthouse emphasized during the day when it appears so drab? Why is the daytime version so drab when this is a fictional and thus presumably idealized Miami? I don't understand why the landmarks are treated with indifference, or why this fictionalized Miami world would seem so realistically dreary in its presentation. A time when you witness a point of emphasis during a race is at the beginning of a day race called Lightning in Frontera Hills. You speed down a straight toward a bright neon radio sign at an intersection before turning left toward an Outrun's neon tubes. The doubling up of neon makes the location feel colorful for a brief flash, and the way these are placed in such a major deceleration point, they act almost as an establishing shot in how they hold the perspective on the radio sign. It reminds me of how many of GTA 5's races are designed. In a lot of ways, the tracks were uninteresting. Even at times when you plod down unconventional paths, it's brief and unimpactful. And at times when you race in interesting locations, like along the beach or at the gravel pits, there's no establishing shot to introduce the atmosphere of your race location, so it's easy to forget what's different or special about any individual track, unless you reach somewhere that you remember hating or remember loving, because the brain deals in absolutes. There are ways to place interesting features in a way that they don't get overlooked, and in a way that helps the player make sense of where they are and what race they're in. Bannister during the day is one of my other favorite races that I didn't bother mentioning in my previous video, but it takes place in the same location as my other two favorites, Voyager and Ring Racer. But even though the races all go through the same park, I don't have to jump over the art sculpture in all of them, making each one feel different. Bannister had an emphasis on the yachts and brick paths. Voyager emphasized the art sculpture, and Ring Racer had a low-key emphasis over the jumps over the canal. Scenery can have the same disorienting effect. Even though there were dozens of switchbacks, probably half of which you can see some part of some skyline, they rapidly blend together because at the end of the day it is a switchback with a skyline at night and no other distinguishing features to that skyline. While you're busy watching for corners, traffic, and your nitrous cooldown, you're only going to capture a glimpse of most emphatic features. This is where in-game landmarks like the power lines and gantry cranes help to demarcate locations. In many games, we experience different aspects of racing culture: road, street, dirt, drift, and drag being the most common. And while a game entirely about taking a road trip sounds like only something I would play because I love boring garbage, it makes for an interesting point of influence for secondary objectives and activities, such as the beauty spots concept in the Forza Horizon series, One could even presume that Burnout's Showtime mode was inspired by another part of car culture, demolition derbies. Need for Speed Heat certainly has elements of niche car culture, like customization with car kits, underglows, dancing, audio systems, and livery design. These aftermarket parts are incredibly important to selling the street racing atmosphere of the street racing theme. Body kits and aesthetics allow street racers and car enthusiasts to imbue personality into their vehicles. As their beast or their princess roll down their street, they artistically convey a message to all who see it. When you hear a turbo chirp, you know that speed matters. When you hear the growl of a V8, you know size matters. When a car is decorated with lights or fuzzy seats, you know that aesthetics matter. Street racers are known to spend thousands of dollars on customization. It is a vital component of the culture, but compared to some other Need for Speed games, Heat's aftermarket choices were much more limited. This is pretty problematic because they didn't really expand the essence of street racing in any meaningful way, while simultaneously choking one of its vital components. One of the shining accomplishments in this game, equivalent to the beauty spots of the Horizon series, was the graffiti collectibles, which unlocked new decals you could use to customize your car, and I did. The street art you could collect around the world made the decals approachable for everyone, but then it felt like it had jumps and drift zones because its contemporaries do too. A game should give you a reason to do things that's more sophisticated than being a completionist, or because it's supposed to be fun. Why am I jumping off all these random ramps to nowhere around the world? Am I a stuntman? An anti-environmentalist? Participating in a gymkhana event? People play games for fun. Usually. They have different objectives. Some people race to have a visceral experience, as a substitute to doing so in real life. Maybe the act of clicking buttons and pulling triggers, causing the coding to make shapes in response to your actions, just does something inexplicable for your monkey brain. But when the tasks in a video game are literally pointless map fillers, it feels ironically insulting. When the gameplay is truly satisfying, or when my mind just wants some gruel to mindlessly dawdle over, there are times when I will partake in pointless map fillers. But just introducing some element of alternative themes, especially taken from car culture, expands these frivolous activities into structural support to the themes of the game, and potentially a feeling of expanded gameplay. Delving into more of a car culture, instead of what came off as random, irrelevant tasks, would bring more depth to the celebration of cars that is the racing genre, and something I think all games should strive to do when creating secondary and tertiary objectives like these. The story of Need for Speed Heat is about the Palm City Police Department, who poured all of its funding into gear to take down street racers threatening the safety of the city's citizens and infrastructure. Except no one ever really talks about those things.
Street racing has no place on public roads. Mark my words, if you are out there and you're engaging in this type of activity, we will find you.
And instead of hiring investigators or undercover police, they just try to solve this critical security concern through horsepower and pit maneuvers. They never construct a profile of you or your vehicles, because by the next night they forget everything about you, including your license plate, your flamboyant decals, and memorable fashion choices. This illegal underground scene, combined with youth culture, is the perfect venue for very vibrant and stimulating art, as reflected in the menus, the graffiti collectibles, and the racetrack set decorations. But it's all unfashionably understated. With street racing, you're talking about a very energetic part of car culture, full of the artistic vigor that is the custom car culture aesthetics that I mentioned previously, and the adrenaline pumping vigor derived from aftermarket performance parts like very infamous nitrous tanks that lend to the danger and illegality of the sport. But this adrenaline pumping action fell short. The theme of the game is street racers, who, by the very nature of their passiveness towards illegality and safety, make me think that the game would be well served by extending that line of thinking. I would love to see a story and theme that is about racers who try to test the limits of cars and of racing. The racetracks in the game were largely restricted to well-kept dirt roads and tarmac. On occasion, we trundled down unconventional paths, like the brick-paved park or the wooden pier. But I believe the game deserves some more spectacle, with race locations revolving around unusual obstacles and unorthodox paths, like swooping between mangrove trees or launching off the deck of an aircraft carrier. Even alleyways are more interesting than the wide streets. Since street racers are already indifferent to danger, and if they're testing the limits, it would be the perfect opportunity to have stunt racing. We didn't get this in the driving stories, but it felt like such a missed opportunity to me that a bunch of rebels using the world as their playground for street racing wouldn't also have friends who use the world as their playground for stunt racing. If you went to a pop concert and the audience just stood there silently, the stage lit only by basic incandescent lighting and no pyrotechnics, you'd probably wonder if you were living in a Twilight Zone episode. But if it was a classical music concert, it would seem normal. This game isn't a racing game. It's a game about street racing and custom car culture, first and foremost, insomuch that even during the daytime sanctioned events, there are little to no regulations on car performance or legal parts. Need for Speed Heat is the pop concert, and it needs pyrotechnics. It needs dramatic lighting like you just crashed through the set of The Weeknd's new music video. It needs more dynamism. Nothing happens in the world space. You never see other street racers. The metro rail doesn't run. There are no city buses, no boats or ships coming to and from port. I wish that street racing fans brought fireworks in the back of their car to the races. Or that sometimes when you were driving around, maybe you saw random events, like street racers in the middle of the night, or police chases. Maybe you could help other street racers get the heat off of them, which then triggers immediate high heat level on you, which could give the players more ways to engage with the mechanic other than just completing activities. I wanted sparks to fly when I crashed into lights, and my tires to kick up dirt like a dust devil. More string lights, more neon lights, more flowers. Make the city look like it's trying to impress someone. Make lights flicker or go off and on inside the buildings like people leaving an office. Make music play out of the clubs as you drive by. Miami is a lively city with an active nightlife. You don't need vehicular manslaughter victims walking around the town to make it come to life. Just some implied signs of life through buses making their hourly routes, metros running above you, dogs barking behind unbreakable fences. Whatever it is the developers think works, but at the end of the day, something more. Even traversing the world was kind of flat. When doing the side quests, Dex and Roshini ask you to follow them and then just casually drive through the city. It seemed like the only excuse the game ever made to slowing down and enjoying the scenery, but at the same time, in the spirit of the game, I kept wondering why they weren't egging me on and being competitive. I was confused by Need for Speed Heat's messaging. I usually expect to decode the developer's perspective of their subject and the game's themes and locations through my experiences in the game world. In a sense, the player is a tourist in the game space the developers created and are trying to show you around. But it feels like Heat's developers are showing you all the most dreary parts of the location, like worn-down Florida natives, which, so far as I can tell, they aren't. They seemed almost inoculated to the tourist perspective of what makes Florida special, and more in tune with the dreary resident perspective. The game's depiction of street racing didn't feel dangerous or pulse-pounding. It seemed like there were childproof locks and everything. But why engage children with an inherently non child friendly subject? It is illegal. It is dangerous. It is violent. It's like making Little Tikes bank robberies. You lose the plot when you distill it because the reality of the theme only exists in the context of its adult content. I like the Star's Need for Speed Heat was shooting for. A few adjustments, a little more fuel, and maybe some sparkles trailing out the back end would have gotten them there. I hope the next installment in this series is even better, because it's all the fans, the developers, and the publishers can ever really hope for.